Hello everyone. I'm kind of doing something a little unusual today. This is because I've been working on a project that honestly I don't know how long it's going to take to get done. It's pretty ambitious, but I felt like I wanted to get a video out and I figured I would do something a little different, so we are doing a tier list. We're following the meme format, I guess. And we're doing it with a series that I haven't really talked about that much, which is going to be Metroid. Metroid, definitely one of the Nintendo series that is closer to my heart, I suppose. I've pretty much played all of them, so I have opinions on all of them, and I figured, hey, why not do something kind of fun and put them into a nice, user-friendly tier list. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to go through all 12 Metroid games, and we're not going to count Metroid Prime Pinball, because, come on guys, it's a pinball game. So, without further ado, let's just get right into it. We're going to go in chronological order, and we're going to start with Metroid, the original game. I'm going to put this one into the C tier. That's where it's going to go, because like a lot of NES games, I don't think that it has aged very well. It is tough to figure out what to do at times, especially if you've obviously never played it before. You can get lost very easily. There are a lot of traps and things like that will just do a lot of damage to you. It's very easy to get killed. You don't necessarily know what you're doing or where you're going. I think that a lot of the strengths of Metroid about exploring, about the atmosphere of where you are, these were things that were very difficult for an NES game to pull off, and so they aren't really all that great here. Although, obviously, I think this game, for an NES game, is pretty ambitious and interesting. I just think it's not quite good enough for me to want to go back and spend much time playing it. So I'm going to put this one in the C tier. Next, we have Metroid 2, The Return of Samus. Probably the least memorable of the classic Metroid games to me. I don't really remember it all that well. It's not something I find myself going back and replaying. I think being on the Game Boy, the qualities I talked about with the first Metroid, those qualities kind of just get worse. It's very hard to make something atmospheric on a Game Boy. The technology, the sound, a lot of the music in this game is just kind of like buzzing. That's kind of what I remember from it. You know, there's a few neat power-ups and things that they tried to put in there, and I think that it's kind of interesting that they chose to take things in the aliens direction and just have the game be about killing a bunch of Metroids. And this did give us the baby Metroid, which is sort of a contentious point of Metroid canon at this point. So I think the game is notable to some degree, but to me, it's not much better than the first Metroid, so I am going to also put this in the C tier as well. Okay, now we're moving on. We're moving on to Super Metroid. This is a quintessential Metroid, I would say. Definitely a game that is in a lot of best game lists. I think the commercial for this game said that it was like Nintendo's best game ever or something. I don't know, I have a weird memory of something like that. Or maybe it was Navigator who said that. My point is, Super Metroid, pretty excellent game. This game gets the atmosphere right. You really do feel like you're exploring this kind of strange, sinister alien planet in this game. It has a lot of really creative power-ups. You got things like the X-ray visor in there. The graphics, I think, are pretty good for the Super Nintendo, and the variety of the areas feels really nice. Great music, of course. You could sort of dock some points for originality, because this is one of many Nintendo games where it's kind of just a remake. In a lot of ways, it is just a remake of the first Metroid, but there is some nice continuity there that I'm kind of surprised they were considering back when this game was first made in the 90s. I like how you go to where the Morph Ball is. You go to some of those early areas from the original game. These are things that I think they would have just ignored or played completely straight, like you would go there for the first time and it would be the same. But here they present it as being like, yeah, you were here a while ago and everything got destroyed. So it's interesting because it does try to be a sequel and not just like a, we're doing this again, you know, like Star Fox 64 or something like that. And I think that that's neat. There's a nice amount of continuity in this game that you do not always get from games from this era. And I think that I obviously, you know, I didn't play Metroid 1 and then play this game, but if I had been a kid playing the first Metroid and then I'd gotten to this, I think that some of the, what story there is in Super Metroid would feel pretty impactful just for the time. Yeah, like I said, this is a quintessential Metroid game. So many aspects of what Metroid is were defined in this one, whether it's sound effects or the visuals of some of the characters or enemies and the music. There's just so much in this game that has defined Metroid. Really, the only thing that makes it, to me, not like the super amazing game is that I think the controls are a little awkward to revisit. I think Samus controls like she's underwater sometimes. It's a little weird, but, it's still a great game and worth checking out if you are interested in Super Nintendo games. And now we're moving along. There was a long hiatus after Super Metroid, and things kind of kicked off with Game Boy Advance. We got Metroid Fusion. This is a game that I think is kind of considered to be a black sheep when you're talking about 2D Metroid games, but I really like Metroid Fusion a lot. I think that it may be one of the Metroid games that I've put a crazy amount of time into. And I think that's because even though there hadn't really been that many Metroid games before this, what defined Metroid wasn't necessarily extremely set in stone. They still took a lot of risks with Fusion, trying to put in more of a narrative, really changing up the location, even making the game more linear to a degree, which I think is sort of a criticism. But it's a criticism that kind of cleverly gets upended later in the game. They have a nice little, almost fourth wall break about that. I think that this game is just very interesting how they decided to go about doing things. I like the X-Parasites as a concept. I thought it was neat how they were trying to get away from Metroids. Also sort of show that, even Metroids, which are these, dangerous creatures, could be suppressing something even worse. It's just a neat idea. A lot of what makes this game memorable to me does come more from the story, and also because the story, especially near the end, went in such a direction that I think, in a way, they have felt totally screwed, and they have no ideas what to do next. Because this is the end of the Metroid timeline. We don't know what happens after Fusion, and Fusion kind of ends on a cliffhanger. Whatever game they make after this, if they don't want to just ignore the story would have to become a really big part of the game. I'm just really surprised that in 2002 that's something they were willing to do, although obviously they never followed up on it, so it might be a bad thing now. I don't even know. But I think the game has some really great visuals. A lot of the bosses stand out to me, like Nightmare is kind of this cool classic boss that I remember. The SAX is something that people also remember fondly, although it isn't really in the game as much as I would like. I just think that this game, some people say that it's trying to be more of a horror game, and I would kind of agree with that, although because it's on the Game Boy Advance, the horror aspect here is certainly better than it would have been if it was on the original Game Boy, but some of the music in this game and the sound design is just not very good. This is one of those games where if you're playing on full blast Game Boy Advance volume, it is so loud. Just go watch the Ridley fight if you haven't seen it. Oh my god. He is screaming like crazy. So there are a few things about this game that kind of aren't the best, but I do think it's a really awesome take on Metroid, putting it in a different direction, mostly with the story, but also with the gameplay. I mean, hey, they took away the signature suit. That's surprising that they would even think to do that. So they were thinking outside the box with this game, and I really do appreciate that. So now we're moving on. This is the same year that Metroid Fusion came out. That's when you had this burst of creativity that ushered in, a lot of Metroid products for the next 5 or so years. You have Metroid Fusion, and then around the same time, made by Retro Studios, you have Metroid Prime, and that's going to go in the S tier for me, personally. A lot of why this is going in that tier. I like all the Prime games. I've often said that I like the whole trilogy. I don't necessarily favor a specific game, but the reason I'm putting this in S tier is because I still can't really believe how well this turned out, because when you just look at the context of it, it's developers from the West trying to take a Japanese property and do something with it when that's never been done before. It's also them taking a 2D game and making it 3D. When you keep those aspects in mind, there have been so many cases where things have gone horribly wrong for one reason or another. And so I can't believe Retro, a company that I don't think they'd never shipped a game before, The fact that they were able to keep their heads down and deliver a game this good on their first try is really amazing. It really stands out. And this game to me is super memorable because of how they took all of the aspects of Metroid, turned it into this great 3D adventure game. This game did come out before shooter controls were really standardized, and so some people might find the lock-on system to be a little weird. I think it works for this game because it's not just about shooting things, it is about exploring, so it didn't have to have perfect shooter controls. And lock-on is fine. I mean, really, you're not going to complain about that. It makes the shooting a little easy at times. I still think that this game nailed having an atmosphere, fantastic music, great sound design, the environments that you go to. While they are very video gamey, you've got the fire area, the ice area and stuff like that. They are designed in a very nice way, especially for the 2000s. I really loved how everything was put together. There just wasn't another game like this when it came out. You know, if you want to play something like Metroid Prime, you pretty much just had to play Metroid Prime. It just stood out to me as a super unique game, and it still stands out that way. I'd highly recommend getting your hands on this if you can. You know, there have been lots of rumors about the Prime trilogy being ported to the Switch. I don't know if that will happen. And this game on the GameCube, it is different. It controls very differently from the Prime trilogy version. So, I mean, really, if you are into playing GameCube games, this absolutely has to be on your list. It just was this crazy... I think in some ways this game kind of felt like playing Mario 64 for the first time, where you're seeing this massive shift. You couldn't perceive Metroid in this way. And it was crazy that they were able to do this, well, kind of on their own. Retro didn't really have super strict guidance from the core Metroid team in Japan. Just hats off to them, and they came through with a game that probably would be in my top 10 games of all time. But now we're moving on to another game. This is also going to be an S-tier game for me, and that is Metroid Zero Mission. The Metroid Zero Mission, of course, a remake of the original Metroid. That is a large reason of why I like it, because they took the original Metroid, re-envisioned it, they took everything that they had learned from Super Metroid and Metroid Fusion, and they came through with just a really quality Metroid experience. Because you have things being sort of re-envisioned and streamlined in a way where it just controls in a super smooth manner. And not only that, but I kind of feel like this is one of the best Metroid games when it comes to speedrunning. I know Metroid has a big tradition of speedrunning. With this game, it almost feels like the speedrunning was kind of built in a sense. And it just makes it a very interesting experience. I like that they added new bosses. You could say that this game is a little unoriginal because, yeah, a lot of things from Super Metroid do show up here. But it's not all unoriginal content. There are a lot of new bosses. I really like the visual style of this game as well. I think that it's just really kind of a perfect blend of what we saw in Fusion and sort of trying to make it look a little smoother. I like kind of the dark shading that you see in some parts of the game. And yes, I think that this game we have 3 games set on Planet Zebes now. This to me really captures it definitively. Also, of course, you can't forget this was the first appearance of Zero Suit Samus, which I think was kind of a significant step in trying to make Samus to be more of a human character. Whether or not you think that was a good idea or that they were successful at it, that's fine. But I think that this is still an aspect of Metroid that people recognize a lot now thanks to Smash Brothers. And it came from this game. Yeah, I mean, just a really solid game. They addressed a lot of the criticisms that people would have with Fusion, and they put them in this game. So if you think Fusion is too linear and there's too much story, then just play Zero Mission, really. Alright, so we're now talking about Metroid Prime 2. Of course, the sequel. Another game that I think is really great. I think it sort of gets a bad rap amongst the Metroid Prime games, but I'm not really sure entirely why. I think there are some ideas in this game that probably could have been executed a little better, or maybe they don't seem that creative. But I consider these ideas to be creative for Metroid because they hadn't really tried them before. What I'm talking about would be the idea of having a light world and a dark world. It's not explored as fully as maybe it could have been. It doesn't feel bad, it doesn't feel forced at all. It's quite a video gamey concept, but when you compare it to other aspects of the game, I think Retro is really trying to make Metroid their own here. Whereas the first game, while they did re-envision lots of aspects of Metroid, it had a lot of things that we were familiar with. It had the Chozo. It It had Metroids all over the place. It had the space pirates. Some of those aspects are still in this game, but they kind of take a back seat in favor of, I think the planet Aether, I think, is really well developed. I really like the look of it visually, and one of my favorite aspects of that is how the planet itself is really kind of divided up by all of the different factions that have a presence here. That's something I find really interesting, because depending on where you are, you know what faction is present. You know, there are aspects of the planet where the Federation is there, so you have all this Federation technology sort of built on top of the natural landscape. You have similar things for the space pirates, where they've got these facilities out, kind of carved out of wherever area you happen to be exploring. You have the Luminoth technology as well, that's sort of built around the landscape too. And of course you have the Ing, you have the dark Aether stuff as well, sort of twisting the environment. And yeah, all of these different societies or groups, what they have going for them visually is put on top of the landscape, and you've got different biomes that I think they tried to make the biomes here more natural, because you have sort of this wasteland desert, you have the Torvus Bog, you've got the Sanctuary Fortress. Some of my favorite Metroid areas as far as the visuals go are in this game, and I just think that they did an excellent job with that. I think the bog is super cool. I love how it sort of becomes this big underground complex as well. Sanctuary Fortress, I think, is one of the coolest areas in the whole place. I think they really outdid themselves with trying to build the world. The scan visor, which I know that was in the first Metroid Prime, but I think they really took it a lot farther with this, the way that you can keep track of all of the data, and how just these really minor aspects of the environment have these nice little bits of lore attached to them. And it's lore that you can digest very quickly. You know, this isn't audio logs or really long pieces of text that stop the game. They really did a great job at solving a problem that I don't think existed for a lot of AAA games yet. And this game, in my opinion, does the best job with all of that. As far as the Dark World, I think it could have been done a little better. I think it could have honestly been made more challenging to get around, because yeah, you do lose health while you're in it, but you don't lose that much, and it's easy to get that health back. The beams, that's a big point of contention. People don't like the light and dark beam, they don't like how they have ammo. I really don't think that that's a huge problem. It is not that hard to get ammunition for the different beam types. I think the big problem is that people felt like because they took ammo, they did not want to use them. And I guess if you just get over your fear of consumables, then that's not really a problem. But that's something that I've seen a lot of people complain about, so I do feel like I will address it. This game did a lot of things right overall. It's a pretty good sequel to Metroid Prime. I don't think there's a really big gulf of quality beneath it, but I am going to put this in A tier just because the novelty of it being a 3D Metroid does not exist anymore. But I still love the game. Great music. Some of the best Metroid music is, I think, in this game. Really, I think my biggest criticism is that it does not feel quite as long as Metroid Prime to me, because there technically aren't as many areas, but the areas that are there, I think, are pretty well designed. They're very well fleshed out. So moving on now, this is something also quite different. This is from the DS era, which doesn't really exist, but we had our Metroid game on the DS. This is going in the B tier for me. This is Metroid Prime Hunters, a game that took a long time to make. I remember they put out this weird demo for it called First Hunt, and it really wasn't that much like the game itself, but it was there really to get you used to the controls. Because that was the big thing about this game, was that you could use the stylus to kind of aim. You had free aim. That was pretty good. I remember being very hesitant to use the stylus aiming, but it definitely helps. It gives you really quick reaction speeds to many things in the game. This game is alright. It's definitely gimmicky, but there are some nice ideas in it. The ideas of including all the other hunters is not bad. And some of them actually have pretty great designs. I think Trace looks really cool. Granted, there are quite a few who I legitimately am struggling to remember their names, but I remember what they all looked like. You got the cool rock guy, there was a Camden. Look, it's not important that I can name all of them, but I do think that they at least tried to differentiate them with the weapons. I like that they have different weapons and you can get those weapons. That's something that they haven't really done much in Metroid, is have that level of weapon variety. You know, it's a pretty short game. It's not super creative. You do go to some different environments, which aren't necessarily that boring, but the game kind of runs out of ideas. The biggest issue with the game is how few bosses it has, and I don't mean like, oh, there's only 2 bosses. I mean, they made 2 bosses and then made you fight them like 8 times, and that just gets really really repetitive. And I like the idea of the hunters being able to follow you around and take your magical keys and stuff. That is a pretty cool idea. It might not go as far as it could have, but it's neat. I think this game is okay. It's definitely not essential to play this game, but there were some neat ideas that definitely haven't really been explored much since. Also, multiplayer, I thought the multiplayer was pretty fun back in the day. I didn't mention Metroid Prime 2's multiplayer because it's honestly not worth mentioning, but I think Hunters did a better job at trying to do something like that. So I'll give them credit for coming through with an interesting multiplayer experience that I did put a good amount of time into, and I thought it was pretty fun. Yeah, that's really all I have to say about that game. Then we go to the next Metroid Prime game, Metroid Prime 3 Corruption. I'm putting that in the A tier as well. I think this game is one of those games that, back when the Wii was a thing, there were a lot of people who were very critical of the motion controls. And there are still a lot of people who think that many games on the Wii, even the great Wii games, only really used motion controls as some kind of a gimmick. They didn't really use them that much. I wouldn't disagree with that. There are definitely some games where you could make that claim. Metroid Prime 3 is not one of them. This is one of those games that, to me, this is the game to play. You put this on like expert control mode, and you see how you do with this game. Because I really enjoyed the motion controls in this game. The free aiming, I thought was great. The game is also kind of built around this now. It has the most combat out of the Metroid Prime games, and maybe that's not what you're looking for. What they did with the controls really amped up the combat. They gave you more options. It's not just about dodging, it's not just about charging up your shots. There are a few other neat tricks you can do. I really like the grapple lasso where you can kind of rip off enemy defense and stuff. It's just very neat to see them try to take that aspect of the game further. But in doing so, it seems like many other aspects of the game were sort of took a backseat. This game is more linear. There's much more of a story this time around. The stakes are bigger, the scope is bigger, you're going from planet to planet now. I don't mind that. It makes the game kind of neat. It makes it interesting from the perspective of a Metroid game because you usually don't do something like that. And I also thought it was kind of interesting because some of these planets, they tried to make them pretty big, or at least feel big. I like the first planet, Brio, because it does have a couple different biomes. It almost feels like Brio could have been its own Metroid setting. It's got all the hallmarks. It's got an ancient alien race that's not there anymore. It's got all these different environments and stuff like that. And that's just the first place that you go to. Skytown, I thought was a really cool looking steampunky environment. Space Pirate Homeworld, I think, is really cool. There's a lot of cool environments here, but the game definitely is a bit more linear. It is not super linear, but you have way more direction as far as what they're telling you to do. And that's not always the best. I think as far as like speedrunning this game, it's like, no, you can't really do that. You can't really do stuff out of order from my understanding of it. I also didn't like some of the streamlining, like how beams are no longer separate things, they stack. That works for some Metroid games, but in Prime, I would have preferred to have different options. Hyper mode is neat, but I feel like it didn't go far enough. You kind of have to force yourself to use it. When it comes to the story in the game, it's okay. It's not rocket science. It's just kind of there. I think that the story could have probably gone farther. A lot of people say they want less story. I kind of wish there was more, because I think that certain aspects of the game would have had more of an emotional impact, if you will, because they have those hunters that you work with, and, they just kind of are there in the beginning of the game. The beginning of this game is quite long. I think it's very linear and long. It's neat, but I don't think it needed to be that way. But after that introduction, you don't see these guys again until you have to fight them and kill them. And I just wish that maybe they had done a better job of integrating them into the story so that when you had to fight them, it felt more tragic. It felt like the stakes of what was happening were stronger. So I don't know. I kind of wish there was more to the story. Same with Samus getting corrupted. That's a really cool idea, and they don't do that much with it. You get some cool game mechanics, I guess. You get the abilities tied to being corrupted, but they don't really explore the idea of like Samus changing all that much, and that would have been something interesting to do. So I don't know. I don't think they were super comfortable with pushing the story further, and I kind of wish that they had. So I feel like I'm in the minority there. That's just how I feel. Still, this game to me is really fun to play. It's just a fun time, and I love the combat in it. They took this control style and put it into the Prime trilogy, and it certainly makes the experience of playing 1 and 2 different. Maybe better if you prefer it this way. I don't know. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens if the Prime games are put on the Switch, and it's going to be very interesting to see what they decide to do for Metroid Prime 4, because I think that the controls in Prime 3 really make it stand out to me. If it didn't have those controls, it might be B tier, but because the combat has improved a lot, and it's more challenging, I'm going to put it in an A tier alongside Metroid Prime 2. So now we are at the next game. This is a game that continues to haunt me. That's Metroid Other M, going in bottom tier. This game is basically the Star Wars prequel trilogy for the Metroid series, if you will, because this is Yoshio Sakamoto. This is some of the guys who have been with Metroid since early on, the guys who've worked on games like Fusion, Zero Mission, people who know how to do Metroid. This is them trying to do something super ambitious, but also there wasn't anyone to suggest that maybe they had a bad idea. And that's really obvious with this game. This game's full of bad ideas that maybe could have been good, but really needed like a big, long thing. And the problem is that there wasn't anyone to do that. This game wasn't really made by Nintendo. This was kind of outsourced. Yes, the creative minds from this game are people from Nintendo. But Nintendo did not have a team willing to commit to this game, willing to do a 3D Metroid game. So they had to go to our boys at Team Ninja, and they sort of built the game. I'm not entirely sure how much influence they had over it. There are aspects of the game where it could remind you of something like Ninja Gaiden, but not really. This game, to me, I don't like it. I don't like it at all. The only parts of this game that are fun are after you've beaten the game and you go back and revisit all the areas to try to collect all the power-ups. Like, what's the point of that, really? You've already beaten the game. And that's what I mean, is that this game just... all of the aspects that make Metroid interesting take a back seat. A lot of ideas, lots of things in this game that they're not really that creative even, but they seem to think that they were. Like, this whole game is kind of like a redo of Fusion, except there is even more of a plot. And that's the big issue with this game. You can't avoid talking about this. This game's plot massively gets in the way of my ability to enjoy this game as a Metroid game. Mostly because not only is it very intrusive, it sucks. This game's got a bad story. There are many aspects of the plot and that don't make any sense when you think about them for more than 5 minutes. They make no sense at all. The plot is broken. It's a busted script. The acting is not good. It's not horrible, but it's not as good as it should have been. This game came out a few years before Nintendo started taking voice acting seriously, and man, this would have been so much better if it had come out a little later maybe, because the characters, they don't emote that much. Samus especially. It's almost like they wanted Samus to sound emotionless, but she doesn't sound cool emotionless. She sounds like a doll, almost. And I think that's a really apt word to use, because I think that's a big problem with the game's story, is that they wanted to give us a deeper look at Samus, but a lot of the deeper looking is taking away from the mystique of the character, but also just making her seem like a loser. It's just really frustrating. There were like attempts to portray her as having PTSD that don't work, and they come off as laughable. The character of Adam Malkovich, who was of course introduced in Fusion, he's totally wasted. I hate how he's portrayed too. And Samus is portrayed as just being like totally obsessed and like pining after him. They don't really have any chemistry in the scenes where they are together. It's so bad. You could probably get a good laugh out of this game. I don't know. I mean, this is one of those games where I've considered just doing videos on it, but goddamn, it's not really relevant anymore because Metroid is back. But this thing killed Metroid for almost 10 years. The creative streak that Metroid was on was demolished by this game. It was a failure financially, creatively. It is a huge failure. It doesn't really play like a Metroid game. It's a bad action game. That's really what it is. It's like you're playing Devil May Cry, but you can only use Dante's guns. Like, that's what this game feels like, and it's not fun. There's a few QTE type moves you can do, but that's it. It is not a good Metroid game. It's not a good action game. It is really tedious to play. It's full of bosses that to me, are not even remotely memorable. The ending is garbage. The plot is garbage. I don't really want to go on a big rant about it, but I suppose I have already done that. Other M, not a good game. Bottom category, all right? So moving on, we have a game that people were extremely pissed about. That's Metroid Federation Force, because it had been like 5 or 6 years since Other M, and nobody had any idea what was going on with Metroid at this point. Retro Studios had been doing Donkey Kong games, so we didn't know what was going on. And then E3, what was it, 2015? They put out this 50-second trailer for Metroid Prime Federation Force. I'm actually not putting this in D tier, I'm putting this in C tier. Most people would put this in the bottom. I am not doing that because I think, unlike a lot of people, I actually played this game. And just to clarify, if you don't know what this is, it is a game where you do not play as Samus, you play as Federation soldiers, and it's supposed to be like a cooperative, action-oriented Metroid game. And that's not a horrible idea, and I think they did an okay job at doing that. The problem with this game is there are a lot of ideas here that just don't work to me. The second level of this game, which involves like shooting at a ball to push it through a level, oh my god, I almost gave up completely. But if you can endure stuff like that, there are some levels here that have a good focus on fun combat, and they do make me think of, you know, the fun parts from Metroid Hunters or Prime 3. There are parts of this game that I think are pretty fun, but they aren't good enough to carry the game as a whole. I do not like the chibi art style that they sort of went with. Samus is in this game, and she looks so stupid because they just kind of made her head really big. I won't spoil the final boss. It's so dumb. If I ever do a tier list of stupid final bosses, I think that final boss would be there. Yeah, it's not as bad as people made it out to be, because people were really pissed off, because this does look like a creatively bankrupt kind of like cash grab thing, because they hadn't announced a real Metroid game. And I don't think that there was good marketing. I think the problems with this game were mostly related to marketing and not so much the game itself. The game itself is okay. It does have its issues, but I don't find it to be anywhere near as bad as something like Other M. So I am putting this in C tier. But at the same time, it's not a very memorable game. It's not a game I would really recommend playing at this point, unless you have other friends with the game. So there's really not a whole lot to say about this one. But a year after, we had Metroid Samus Returns. That's a game that I'm going to put in the B category. This is the most recent Metroid game as of now, and I really think that they needed to talk about this game in tandem with Federation Force. That was the big problem. We didn't know this game existed. If people had known there was a real Metroid game on the way, I don't think that people would have been anywhere close to as annoyed by Federation Force. But that's really not what happened. Samus Returns is a remake of Metroid 2, which is not a bad idea, especially when you're trying to bring 2D Metroid back. This game was also, I think, made by the people who did some of those Castlevania reboot games. So it's a European take on the franchise, if you will. I think this game's alright. It is not the most memorable Metroid game, but I think there are definitely some improvements that I liked quite a bit. I like that you have the free aiming, where you can pretty much aim in any direction. It's great to have that in a 2D Metroid game. It is used quite well because there's lots of enemies where you have to kind of hit their weak points, which might be like their soft underbelly. And when you use it in tandem with power-ups, like the wave beam and the plasma beam, it feels pretty satisfying. You have some melee options in this game that are honestly better than some of the stuff that was in Other M. I think that they did a great job trying to update a 2D Metroid game and trying to make Metroid 2 as good as it could be. But that is also the biggest shortcoming with this game, is that it is a remake of Metroid 2, so there isn't really that much you could do with it, because Metroid 2, to me, is one of the weaker Metroid games. The structure of the game is kind of lacking. It is very linear in a lot of senses. It's very, well, I shouldn't say it's linear, it's very level-based, whereas some of the other games are more freeform. So I think that this game is okay, but the biggest problem is just that it's just Metroid 2 again, and Metroid 2 is an okay game. I really wish that this game had gotten a sequel that was an original game. That's the biggest problem, or that's the biggest shame, I should say. This thing came out at a time when the 3DS was not really relevant anymore. If this game had come out a few years earlier, and they had done a sequel that was more creative, man, that just, to me, that would have been so cool. But we have not gotten that. I don't expect us to get that. And yeah, the future of Metroid, I would say, is pretty uncertain, but not uncertain in a horrible way, because we know that it's in the hands of Retro Studios, who hopefully can make a good Metroid Prime game. At the same time, I feel like there's so much about the Metroid franchise that we don't really know about because it's just like games that were stuck in development hell. And Metroid Prime 4 is one of those games now. It's been a long time since we've heard anything about it, but I really hope that we can get some news relatively soon, because there's so many directions you could take a fourth Prime game in, so many directions you could take Metroid in as a whole, and these games to me, for the most part, are pretty good, and there's a good amount of variety, but they are Metroid games at the end of the day, and that's just something that we don't get a lot in the AAA space anymore. Metroid, super influential in the indie scene, but I would love to see a nice, full, well-rounded, a big budget take at this again. And so there's definitely a part of me that is very eager for Metroid Prime 4, but not so eager that I'm gonna go looking up all these terrible fake leaks that everyone is always making about it. But that's all I have to say. Thank you for listening, and please let me know if you would like to see more tier lists. It's not something I plan on doing very often. They're very easy to make, I feel, but hey, I've played a lot of games, so it's something that I could totally do. Either way, I'll see you guys next time. Thank you for watching.